Shabbat Shalom. Hopefully at some part of your Jewish education you have come across the great figures of Hillel and Shammai. These were rabbis in the later days of the Second Temple period, two of the greatest teachers that our people have ever known. However, as great as they were as teachers, their students, not so much. That isn't to say that they were terrible teachers. They did a great job for themselves, but as students per se, they were not quite able to match the teachings of their respective sages. And that meant that following the passing of Hillel and Shammai, we ended up with Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, literally translated unhelpfully as the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai, better put into the school of thought of Hillel, the school of thought of Shammai, and each of these two categories had numerous disciples that were active in the Jewish world, and as they were not quite as conversant as their teachers, because they were not up to that stretch, they disagreed on almost everything. That is to say, Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai multiplied their arguments, their debates, their discussions, and it got nasty. It was, well, I suppose in the modern political American scene, we can see some of what it can happen when debates get out of hand between different viewpoints of what should be done. Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai take it as being something similar to that, although thankfully, at least from the records we have, not nearly as vicious in the rhetoric, but certainly no less determined to ensure that their way would be the way for the Jewish people, that Beit Hillel or Beit Shammai would be universally recognized as the singular, correct way to live a Jewish life. Everybody's with me so far, I hope. For 3 years, this battle raged within the Jewish community between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. Tempers were hot, arguments were created, there was tension between the two groups, although never quite as much as you might think. Ask me about that later, until it was finally resolved. The story goes, according to the Talmud, that eventually, after the 3 years of arguing had gone on long enough, a bat kol, a voice from heaven, proclaimed, Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim. These and these are the words of God. What does that mean? It means the words of Beit Hillel are indeed divine words. These are, in fact, the words of God. And the words of Beit Shammai are indeed the divine words of God. Elu ve'elu, both of these are correct. Everybody always loves that answer, don't they? Because, wait a minute, hold on, wait, how can we both be correct? If I say this is ritually pure and he says it's ritually impure, they can't both be God's word, because which one is it? Well, God was saying that there is a way to interpret Torah that will validate either position. Neither one of them is superior in their understanding of God's will than the other. Both are legitimate expressions of Torah and thus of what God wants in the world. But don't worry, the bat kol didn't stop there. The voice continued to say, however, the halacha, the Jewish law, goes according to Beit Hillel. Yay, they won. The Talmud immediately asked the question, but why? And the answer, of course, was given there, is that, well, because Beit Hillel was more courteous, Beit Hillel was more deferential to their opponents, and Beit Hillel would teach their opponents' teachings first, before they would then teach their own teaching in contradiction. Now, the astute among you may be asking yourself, wait, why did we need a because? After all, if the bat kol, if a voice from heaven shouted out, Hillel is right, do we need additional explanation? Do we need a justification, a rationalization? Does God have to show his work when he hands in the homework assignment? Yes. Well, kind of, yes. Because there is many other famous stories within the Talmud and rabbinic teaching that says absolutely that we don't make decisions by divine fiat. We don't make decisions because a heavenly voice told you so. Because if we go down that road, we get into trouble real fast. If we allow divine fiat to dictate what we will do, we find quickly it becomes authoritarian fiat. That somebody who speaks on behalf of what God told them, oh, of course, you weren't there that day, but trust me, this is what God said, will wield that power in an authoritarian manner and completely destroy any community over which it holds sway. In Judaism, we put an end to that very early on. We put very strict conditions for what prophets could and couldn't do. None of them could contradict what the Torah said. And we very quickly even said, you know what, prophets, stick to encouraging people or reprimanding us, but leave halakha to the open debate. Leave our discussion of law to frank and free exchange of ideas and an eventual discussion that will lead to a conclusion by majority. And indeed, this has been the Jewish practice ever since. We have established ourselves outside that shroud of divine mystery and said, God gave us Torah, and between Torah, our traditions, and our mind, we have enough to solve any problem that may come to us, as long as we do that together and recognize that second explanation, that we do it in a manner that is both civil and courteous, and that we take our opponent's consideration with full consideration, our opponent's arguments with full consideration, and then reply to them in an appropriate manner. So, problem solved. Well, yes, within the Jewish world. More or less, this has worked for about 2,000 years. But you may have noticed occasionally, Jews are not the only people on the planet. And you may have also noticed that for most of the last 2,000 years, we have not actually wielded power. We have not had authority over ourselves to a great degree, and certainly not authority over others. Instead, it has been much the reverse. And for most of the last 2,000 years, while we have had varying degrees of autonomy and religious freedom, most of the time we have been under the expressed authority of different political entities. And for most of the last 2,000 years, those political entities have had a religious bent. But no problem, right? Because for most of the last 2,000 years, we have been under the authority of the Abrahamic religions, with which we share so much in common. So what could be wrong with that? Don't we agree on most things? Well, yes and no. Let me take a couple of cases to see what problems have occurred over the last thousands of years with other national entities, other coercive authoritarian regimes using their religious standard in ways that have made things difficult for us. So for example, all the way up until the middle of the 20th century, within American public schools, the day might begin with the Pledge of Allegiance. The day might begin with the national anthem. And the day might begin with the Lord's Prayer. Nothing wrong with that. We like prayer, right? And Avinu Shebashamayim, our Father who art in heaven, right? That's a standard Jewish phrase. So why would Jewish people be upset about having the Lord's Prayer be recited mandatory in public schools? Does anybody here remember when that was common practice in this country? I'm seeing a few nods. Yes, a couple hands. So what was wrong with it? I mean, I'm a rabbi. I like prayer, right? I mean, you all kind of have figured that out, I hope by now. So wouldn't I want people to pray more? I mean, I am always bemoaning to anyone who will join our education committee that we don't have enough hours to teach our kids. Why not allow our public schools, where the majority of our children attend, to supplement what we do here in our religious school and, teach a little Bible, teach a little prayers? What could be wrong with that? Any ideas? Either from personal experience or go ahead and hypothesize. Oh, well, yeah, there's going to be a lot of Jesus being mentioned. And indeed, there was a lot of Jesus being mentioned in public schools until the Supreme Court finally struck down that type of behavior. And in Judaism, we have learned that while there might be the hypothetical benefit of allowing the Bible in general to be taught, we are not going to be in a position to decide what that Bible will say and how it will be taught. That, yes, I would love for our kids to be able to learn the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and I'd love for them to hear the story of the Exodus. I'm not so keen on them being taught that Jews were the murderers of Jesus and that they bear an eternal guilt for that. I'm not so keen for our children to be taught they are going to hell if they do not accept Jesus as their personal Savior. But once you say that it's fine to teach the Bible in school, guess which version is going to get more screen time? The Christian version, because it is the majority within our country. And I am not convinced that that would make life better for our children or for adults, for that matter. Would we like to have to make Christian prayer part of our court proceedings or an obligatory part of swearing in? A litmus test of faith. There have been times in the United States where different states have required a statement of faith, and certain religions need not apply. You could not serve in public office because you did not swear in the right name. There are problems with this. As much as I am tempted to say, give me a full school and give me the ability to teach this, and maybe things will be better, but there is the danger on the opposite side that it is not going to be Jewish principles that are being taught. Did I see a hand? There is nothing explicitly within the Lord's Prayer. It is, in its content, actually a remarkably Jewish prayer, which is impressive. However, in its full structure and in its entirety of context within the Christian Bible, it is still a Christian prayer. When we say, Our Father, and you are speaking from a Christian source, you do not mean the same thing as we mean when we say Avinu, a singular, non-Trinitarian understanding of what that Father means. So while the words themselves literally do not lend themselves either to Christianity or to Judaism, certainly the common understanding and the way that it would be explained within a community absolutely does. And that is one of the pernicious elements of the idea of prayer in school or teaching religious principles in school, is that while the texts themselves may appear to be ecumenical and interfaith and established a broad understanding, the way it will be taught with the faith belief of the majority, and the rest will be made to understand that and to feel that. Let me give you the underlying issue here. Because let's imagine that we are now in a school where this prayer is mandatory, and there's little Abraham, Jewish kid, and he does not want to do the Lord's Prayer. He does not want to sing the Christmas carols, Come All Ye Faithful, O Silent Night, or all the other ones that even I was still growing up with in the public school, because those are overtly declarations of salvation through a different God, and therefore he does not feel comfortable. And the teacher says, fine, you don't want to participate, you get detention. Isn't that what you do to a child who refuses to behave and participate in lessons of a class? You use coercion. That's what you do. If he refuses to participate in the math assignments, then there will be some disciplinary measure. If he refuses to participate in the history assignments, there will be a disciplinary measure. If he refuses to behave and participate in the theological assignments, why would there not be? It's part of the curriculum. It is mandated by the school board or by the state or, God forbid, the federal government. Therefore, you are responsible to do it, and failing to do it, you will be failed. Coercion becomes essential when you have a state apparatus working on behalf of a religion. Coercion becomes essential, not optional, when you have a state apparatus working on behalf of a religion. We face this as well within this country. Under Jewish law, what are the grounds for divorce? What does the husband have to prove in order to get a get for his wife and divorce her? Nothing. Nothing. That was another one of those arguments back with Hillel and Shammai of exactly what you had to prove. And the argument, the settled law is according to Hillel, and the answer is nothing. If the husband wants to divorce his wife because he doesn't like her cooking, he can divorce her for the cooking. If he doesn't just, feel like being married to her anymore, that's fine. There is no requirement that there actually be a criminal or moral failing within that marriage before a divorce can be granted. For a very long time, until the middle again of the 20th century, that sort of no-fault divorce didn't exist in most parts of the United States, which meant in order to exercise our right to be divorced for the grounds that we in our faith believe are sufficient, we would have to invent some other moral turpitude to use as an excuse to a secular court to allow our people to be divorced. Do you understand the lunacy of this? That we would have to lie to say there had been a greater crime than there had been, just to be able to do what our religion says we have the right to do. Coercion is essential. If you use a religious standard to establish your law, then you are asking the court to act as a coercive agent in defense of your religion. And what you are actually saying when you do that, when you say, I need the state to defend my interpretation of what God wants me to do in this issue, you are saying it is indefensible on its own. Look, I want our kids to pray. And I work hard in our religious school, as some of our students here will tell you. But ultimately, I know that coercion doesn't work. If the only way I can make them pray is by threatening them, by God forbid, I would never, but by like what used to be done, by hitting them, by ratting them out to their parents because, they weren't loud enough during our tefillah time, and shaming them in front of others, do you think that's going to increase their devotion and dedication to Judaism? Or is it only going to increase the anger that they feel every time they are dragged through these doors? And thus, when they are finally old enough to no longer be dragged by their parents, never set foot in a synagogue again. How many Jewish children were wrapped by the ruler in their cheder? And once they no longer had to associate with the Jewish community, they chose no longer to associate with the Jewish community. When we lack the ongoing coercive elements to be able to force compliance, then coercion at any pre or prior stage is only going to alienate people from that feeling. They aren't going to love God because they were shamed in front of the room. They aren't going to love the Bible because someone hit them hard enough. There isn't a magic number of spankings that will make a child devout when they finally have the choice. Of course, if you take away that choice when they are an adult as well, if you say, no, you understand, you must be a member of a religious institution. You must show up. We'll be taking attendance at church. And if you are not there, we will notice. And then we will send around the police to ask you some questions about why you weren't there. Sounds a little far-fetched, right? A little dystopian? That's my family's history. My family was destroyed by the Spanish Inquisition. And that is exactly what happened. If you live in Spain, you go to church. If you don't go to church, we will come and knock on your door and ask you why. And you better be on deathbed. Because otherwise, we'll remember that your family used to be Jewish. And then we will suspect you of secretly daring to still believe something other than the Catholicism that we have forced upon you. And if we suspect that hard enough, well, then we can torture you. Then we can find out who else has been involved in this conspiracy to undermine our faith by daring in private, in small cellars, windowless rooms, to light candles. Because we, the state apparatus, know that you lighting candles on Friday night will destroy the king and queen, will be the ruin of Catholicism. Because God apparently can't defend the king, can't defend his own faith without us torturing and burning those who disagree. My family was lucky to survive somewhat intact with a few of the stories, and thankfully my mother was able to find her way back, unknowing this history, into Judaism. But I have hundreds, my mother has shown me, of cousins that did not find their way back, that are no longer Jewish, and are no longer, most of them, anything. Why in the world would they feel an allegiance to a faith that was wrung out of them and their ancestors on the rack? This is what happens when you allow a state to defend a religion. Ultimately, Judaism believes a great many things. I believe that people should keep Shabbos. I believe people should keep kashrut. I believe people should be adhering to the various moral, ethical laws of our people. But I do not want the state to help me enforce those. Because I know that should we do that, the number of people who actually believe in them will diminish rather than increase. Compliance will go up, but so will resentment, so will bitterness, and so will a feeling that I don't actually need to believe, I just have to follow the rules. It's not a statement of belief when I follow the speed limit. I just don't want to get a ticket and I don't want my insurance to go up. But Judaism wants us to feel that what we are doing is right and beneficial and meaningful to us. And that cannot be achieved through force and compulsion. As Jews, we need to be able to live freely, and that means we need a system to live underneath, a societal system that does not prefer or show antagonism towards any religion. Because the religious values and ideals and interpretations and laws of one faith are not going to be compatible with ours. And even my own may not be compatible with yours. There is diversity already within this room. Would you like me to come and check your kitchens for my standard of kashrut? I don't think so. And to be honest, not vice versa either. Judaism says, quite simply, if you don't want people to violate your standards of when life begins, convince them. Like Beit Hillel, be solicitous. Be careful in your arguments and deliberation. Find a way to convince them that your opinion of where life begins and what should be done from that point forward, that your opinion is right. But if you can't convince them, how dare you reach for the levers of power? How dare you reach for weapons to compel their obedience? If you have particular ideas about how someone should be allowed to marry or not marry, or divorce or not divorce, fine. You practice your life according to those principles. But how dare you trample upon my religion, telling me who I can or cannot marry, telling me when I can or cannot get divorced. Don't worry, Penelope. Speaking in the general you. This is the underlying challenge to all faiths. We live in a time where faiths no longer have a strong hand on the reins of state power. And for many religions, they are, quite honestly, freaking out about this, and they have been for about the last 200 years. How can we survive without state support? Both Christianity and Islam were promulgated and established at sword point. How can they survive when they don't have that capability anymore? What will become of us? Well, Judaism says Hello? We haven't had state power for 2,000 years, and yet we're still here, despite everything thrown at us. We still have people who believe. We have people who are committed. We have people who will give up their Saturday mornings to come listen to a sermon about religious freedom. We're okay. Could be better, but we're okay. Are you telling me that Christianity and Islam, Buddhism, Sikhism, Hinduism are weaker than Judaism? That our faith is able to compel belief simply by persuasion? Simply by allowing others to see the benefit to their lives, but your faith can't? Are you telling me that no one would actually agree with you enough to follow your principles unless there was a policeman standing behind them? But Jews are willing to follow Torah, even though no one has been able to effectively punish for hundreds of years what a Jew does or doesn't do? It is an interesting paradox for many other faiths. But for Judaism, it is obvious. Religious freedom is at the heart of allowing us to come to God. It was the first request that Moses made to Pharaoh. The first request. Let these people go that they may worship their God. And it was the first denial that Pharaoh gave. We didn't ask to be liberated from slavery first. We asked only to be allowed to worship. But a tyrant knows. Allowing people to follow the conscience of their minds, to follow the spirit in their heart, will eventually lead them out from under your thumb if you are a tyrant. On the other hand, if you are truly a believer in the equality of all, the freedom of all, and that our society is built by all, and that no one person or group should have authority over others without their consent, then this poses no threat whatsoever. No one will come to compel anyone to act against their faith, and no one should come to compel anyone to stop their faith. It's a very simple equation, one that we, as Jews, know better than most is essential for true living, and one that we as Jews, even more than most, have an obligation to defend, to protect, and to expand to cover more and more people and more cases. The United States is perhaps the greatest blessing of freedom that the Jews have ever experienced outside of our own land. But it is up to us to not only show gratitude for this gift, but to defend what it is that has made America so beautiful and such a perfect place for us as well. Shabbat Shalom.